Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 26 of Truth is Justice. Over the last 6 months, I've developed a greater appreciation for the way in which this case has been generally portrayed. I understand how Bob was initially able to generate sympathy for Sandra and accumulate a following of people that believed in her innocence. As I've said before, the success of that approach was heavily reliant on a purposefully selected release of information, both the specific type of information that was released and the timing of that release. Approaching it that way ensured that the narrative could be tightly controlled by Bob. There could be no mention of the computer logins because Bob didn't release that report or discuss it in any detail other than to use it to support the claims that an extensive and thorough digital forensic examination found no evidence of Sandra's guilt. And there was no mention of the marijuana transaction because Bob didn't release that report. No mention of Liz's social media posts, which provide an insight into the family dynamics. No detailed discussion of the missing TV, the TV that eventually was discovered in the study, but that could only be matched when the receipts were published. Our involvement here at Truth is Justice somewhat interfered with that process. We published the forensic IT report, which resulted in the discovery by Adam of the login information, which at the very least gives us information about the timings of events within the Melgar home. We published information on the marijuana transaction that Sandra was involved in and allowed a discussion to take place on that. We published the receipts from Aaron's for the Sylvania 32-inch TV DVD that allowed the TV in the study to be identified, which then resulted in a complete change in the story the family offers around the missing master bedroom TV. And there are so many more examples. The reason I bring those points up is to demonstrate that despite what Bob describes as a deep dive into a given case and going over everything with a fine-tooth comb, it is, in reality, just a carefully selected presentation of the defence case. And that is a perfect approach, really. I've said before, if you present the defence argument on almost any case, you will be able to gather support for a wrongful conviction. The only thing that caused a problem with that approach was Truth is Justice getting access to the case material and presenting a balanced view, allowing everyone to read everything and make up their own minds. And we have plenty of critics, but the nature of that criticism speaks volumes about what we are doing. It isn't criticism for our publishing the trial records or the expert reports in full, or the TV receipt, or anything else. It is criticism of us as people. It is ad hominem attacks ranging from a suspicion of whether several of us even exist, to whether we are one person created based on several other people. Last week I addressed on our Facebook page yet another post on a page associated with Bob's show, which claimed that I wasn't who I say I am. And one of Bob's devout followers claimed that they went to significant efforts in researching me and described that process in their post. Most concerning was the fact that the post received more than a handful of likes and some unsettling words of support and encouragement for the person who was doing the researching. Now, Bob claimed last Friday that he doesn't engage in stalking, and we have no option really but to take his word for that. What I do think is interesting though is the way in which he describes to his followers how he waits outside people's homes to rummage through their garbage to obtain samples from which he can extract DNA. Activities that seem to rev up his followers even more and empower them to take their own actions. Now, you can't call that stalking, but it does require an element of covert action and an awareness of your surroundings and presumably a goal of not being seen to be rummaging through the garbage. I've said before that I couldn't care less what people think of me. If you don't believe who I say I am, make something up and run with that. It really doesn't bother me, and it really has no relevance to what we are trying to do here at Truth is Justice. It doesn't matter whether it is me sharing the material and correcting the false and misleading statements or anyone else. The important thing is that the material is being shared. If you don't like the full story being shared, which many of Bob's followers don't, the answer is simple. Don't listen and don't read anything we publish. Read the carefully selected material that Bob shares and listen to the statements that he makes. To those people that continue to focus their research efforts on me and some of those people that support what I'm trying to do, please just think about what value there is in doing that. You may get a warm round of applause from the followers and maybe even score a free hat from Bob as a reward for a job well done. And don't laugh, exactly that happened earlier in the year. But in the end, all you are doing is making yourself look silly. There is no point asking you to stop, or to direct an equivalent amount of attention to a valuable cause. It is better just highlighting how ridiculous you look. And to those people that continue to support me, despite the downsides to doing so, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. If anyone listening to this doesn't believe the lengths to which Bob's followers are prepared to go to, I completely understand. I never would have believed it prior to becoming involved in this case. If you want to get a glimpse into what is just below the surface, start up a podcast similar to what we have done and wait for the backlash. It is swift, sustained, and it says a lot about how troubled some of the followers are. It will completely change the way you view some of those people deeply invested in this true crime sphere and the questionable ethics behind the operations of shows like Bob's. At least that's been the effect it has had on me. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. Before we go back to the DNA material and how that was presented by the state, I wanted to take a closer look at Bob's interview with Mr. Jim Clemente. The interview Bob conducted with Jim was episode 15, so relatively early on in his coverage of the Melgar case. And that is relevant because, as I will demonstrate, many of the things Jim highlights are now far easier to understand than they were back then. The context of the things he raises is significantly different now that we have access to all of the case material and additional external material to inform our analysis. To start, I wanted to highlight how Jim seemingly approached this discussion with Bob. He seemed to have little to no knowledge of the case, despite Bob noting that he had provided Jim with a summary of the case and a 6-page victimology assessment that Bob himself had prepared, and the photos and reports, etc. To demonstrate that, Jim asks the question of Bob during the first part of the interview whether Jim and Sandra had any children. And whilst it's possible that that piece of information was simply overlooked by Jim, it probably does indicate to us that his review of any material Bob gave him was brief at best. Another indication of that is when Jim asks whether Jim and Sandra ended up going out for dinner, or whether Jim was murdered before that. Again, that represents a reasonably significant element of the case. And Bob does ask Jim whether he has been through the case summary, and Jim indicates that he has. It would seem to me to be difficult to read a summary of this case without knowing whether Jim and Sandra had any children, and to not know whether they went out for dinner, and to not know whether their car was parked inside the garage or outside. And why is it relevant whether Jim had reviewed any of the material before speaking with Bob? I think it's relevant because I think it gives an insight into the validity of some of the statements that Jim makes. In my opinion, they are almost more valuable because Jim doesn't know what impact his comments are going to have. Remember, we now know that Jim is involved in the television production that Bob has promoted on his show. And for those that don't know about it, it is spruiked by Bob as being a television version of his podcast, so a show focused on wrongful convictions. Now, Jim's involvement is relevant in the context of considering his interview with Bob, because Jim necessarily has to take a neutral or biased position with respect to wrongful convictions. It would hardly be supportive of a wrongful conviction case if one of the key players in it raised material that suggested it wasn't a wrongful conviction. So, getting into the interview. Bob begins it by noting that following Ms. Barnett's appearance on his show, he and his audience have picked through every crime scene photo and every detail of the case with a fine-tooth comb. He notes how the picture of the crime scene that night is becoming more and more clear. And we all now know that that summary is inaccurate. Yes, Bob and his followers picked through elements of the case with a fine-tooth comb, such as the poster which had fallen off the wall and the back door lock, but they didn't look at all of the elements of the case. Only those elements that Bob chose to share with his audience, those elements which supported the narrative he wanted to present. The picture of the crime scene, the story the crime scene tells us, is indeed clearer, but that is in large part due to the ability for people to view and consider all of the case material and additional external material, warts and all. Jim notes at the outset that this isn't the most complicated case he has seen. He points out that it is interesting, noting that there are elements from both sides of the spectrum that are worthy of consideration. And they start with victimology. And this is where we have a very clear indication of Bob's intentions with respect to how he frames the narrative for Sandra. There are some very carefully selected words that I will draw attention to. Bob notes that right up front there are no obvious risk factors, and he demonstrates that in a couple of ways. Firstly, he notes that Jim is not a drug user or abuser. He specifically highlights Jim. Now, you could argue, I suppose, that the victimology is solely related to Jim, and that is why Bob chose to make the drug user, abuser comment specifically about him and not Sandra. But I guess you could also argue that if you believe the intruder or the home invasion argument, Sandra is also a victim and so would relevantly be included. Regardless, at least at that point, we have no indication that Bob has given Jim any indication of Sandra's drug use or her marijuana transaction, which occurred just weeks before Jim was murdered. And Bob highlights that there is no evidence of extramarital affairs. I agree that there is no specific evidence of that, but there also wasn't a comprehensive look at all of the electronic devices in the home, despite what has been claimed. The white laptop in the southeast corner bedroom, for example, does not appear to have been reviewed at all. We do have evidence of a large number of visits to online dating sites, and they may all be completely innocent, but equally they may not be, and that would then significantly change the victimology. Now, Bob talks about the financial position of the Melgars, noting that they had a comfortable amount of money, but to use his words, they were not super duper rich, in a way that would provide motive to someone. Jim cautions that view of Bob's, noting that the consideration of wealth in the context of a motive for a burglary or a home invasion is somewhat relative, noting that to some, the Melgars' level of wealth could indeed be a huge motivation. And this is a relevant point of Jim's because many have dismissed the possibility that Sandra could have been motivated to murder Jim for the money. I suggest that it is equally possible that she did, and her post-murder behaviour would seem to support that. The purchase of multiple homes, including a beach house and an overseas holiday just months after Jim's murder, would, at least to me, indicate that Sandra was enjoying unfettered access to the wealth that they had accumulated as a couple, enjoying that access without having to report to Jim or to justify the use of those funds in any way. Bob asks Jim to summarise why victimology is important, and Jim gives a summary, noting that offenders pick a particular victim at a particular time, at a particular place, in a particular manner, and for a particular purpose. He notes, importantly, how all of those elements leak out information and how, from the perspective of the victim, at the time of their murder, was there anything that stepped up the risk in their life? And Jim specifically brings up drug use and notes that it represents a high-risk behaviour. He notes how drug users interact with drug dealers and those that want to take the money that you are spending on those drugs. And this is where we get an indication that Jim was likely not provided with the information about Sandra's marijuana transaction in the weeks leading up to the murder. Had he have been provided with that information, I suggest that he would have asked more questions, especially given that he categorises drug use as a high-risk activity. Now, we've been given very little background information on the drug purchase. So was it a regular purchase that Sandra would make, or was it the first time she had bought marijuana? Was it her first avenue to make that purchase, meaning how many people did she contact prior to that transaction, or after that transaction? Did she interact with others who rejected or possibly ignored her request? And what was Jim's take on the purchase, or on Sandra's drug use generally? It has been said that Jim would have to hide Sandra's medication to ensure that she didn't take more than she was supposed to. We don't know how accurate that claim is, but if it is accurate, how happy would Jim be for Sandra to purchase what I consider to be a large quantity of marijuana? Now, how is the marijuana use viewed within the Jehovah's Witnesses? If you search for it, it doesn't take long to find what the views of the religion are with respect to marijuana use. Aside from the reality of its use being illegal, at least in the state of Texas and at least at that point in time, very specific mentions are made in various Watchtower issues of exactly why the use of marijuana is considered so abhorrent. It certainly doesn't appear to be an issue of conscience. So, going back to Jim's point about the risk profile at the time, imagine if this was Sandra's first attempt to purchase a large quantity of marijuana, the very first time, and it happens to fall within weeks of Jim being murdered. In my opinion, that would represent a very significant coincidence. So I think all those are valid questions, but all questions that, from what we can tell, will not even raise with Jim Clemente, but that Jim himself notes represent a very significant high-risk factor. Now, Jim notes immediately following his description of drug use that based on what Bob is telling him, Sandra and Jim didn't have any kind of high risk that was apparent in their lives. Bob states correct and agrees with Jim, then immediately steers the topic away from drug use and focusing back on the financial side of things. So why did Bob not feel that it was relevant to raise Sandra's drug use? Who knows? Did it slip his mind? Did he not know about it when he conducted the interview with Jim? Did he know about it but chose not to raise it? In the end, it seems like it was a very important part of the interview and insightful on Jim's part, and the deflection on Bob's part was very notable. The discussion then moves on to Jim and Sandra's relationship, and Bob provides some background information. Married for 32 years, childhood sweethearts, and the story of Jim flirting with her, etc. He also talks about how their 32nd wedding anniversary was just 10 days prior to the murder, and he lists out the various medical ailments that Sandra has that may have contributed to why they were unable to celebrate their wedding anniversary on the actual day, and instead had to wait until 10 days later. But Jim doesn't highlight that as an important element. In fact, Bob moves on from that topic very quickly, directing the conversation to the events on the evening of the murder, including providing details of the known facts as he calls them. I think it's worth highlighting the wedding anniversary celebration as yet another significant coincidence. This wasn't a usual day for the Melgars, it was a very significant day. One of the very few events that the Jehovah's Witnesses allow their followers to celebrate. In providing the known facts, Bob places the Melgars leaving their home to go out for dinner at between 6:30 and 7 p.m, and noting that they returned home at about 10 p.m. We obviously now know that they didn't leave home until at least 7:30 p.m, and we know that because of the computer forensic information. The HP laptop was last accessed that evening at about 7:31 p.m, meaning that it was likely that they didn't leave for dinner until possibly closer to 8. We also know that they probably got home at about 9:35 p.m, because the CVS store receipt has a timestamp on it of 9:33. So why is that relevant, and what is a possible reason for why a more factually accurate overview of the times was not shared with Jim? Because when you look at the timings, it would mean that Sandra and Jim were actually out for their special, romantic, 10-day overdue anniversary dinner at their favourite restaurant for less than 1 hour. Strange, given that Bob notes how a neighbour described them as being excited to be going out for that dinner. That Sandra suggests that they talked for 2 hours non-stop in a jacuzzi over the noise of the jets, yet lacked enough conversation to extend a special restaurant dinner celebration for any longer than an hour is very interesting. Perhaps it means nothing, or maybe it gives us an insight into how their relationship was that night. The conversation then moves on to the drive home, and Sandra's suggestion that someone followed them, and Bob frames that by saying that it would be a 10-minute drive from the CVS to the Melgars' home. For those that are not on our Facebook page, Danielle made an excellent post about that a few months ago, with some great contributions from Adam and others, and then a more recent post continued the discussion. Google Maps offers up a suggested driving time between the CVS and the Melgars' home of 3 minutes. The distance is 1 mile. Individuals have actually done the drive, and they suggest that the reality at around 9:30 p.m. is that the drive takes 2 minutes and 20 seconds. It is a very short, uncomplicated drive. So after leaving the CVS store, they would merge onto Gessner Road and travel along that for maybe 3/4 of a mile. They would have turned right onto Laurel Bridge, then right onto Village Terrace, and left into Kelsey Meadows. Now, Sandra suggests that they were followed until the turn at Village Terrace. That would suggest that they were followed for perhaps 90 seconds or less, and that there was just the one turn which led to a large number of side roads. Now, Adam noted how the detectives asked Sandra about streetlights. That was a valid question, perhaps even informed by their knowledge of the area, because there are points along Gessner Road and Laurel Bridge where the car following them would have been lit up by streetlights, including a point where they potentially would have been side by side. As Adam identified, the entrance to the Laurel Creek subdivision is double-laned, so left-turning and right-turning cars have their own lane. That would have meant, if the other car was right behind them, as Sandra suggests, they should have had a clear view of the car and the occupants. But Sandra doesn't give any indication that that happened. The reality is, it is difficult to understand how someone could assume they are being followed over a period of about 90 seconds and not simply the far more innocent explanation that someone was driving in the same direction that they were. If Sandra had a level of paranoia so significant that she would jump to that conclusion in such a short period of time, it potentially says something about her state of mind. To think that, as Sandra suggests, in a period of perhaps 140 seconds or less, Jim and Sandra determined that they were being followed, had a disagreement over Jim's driving because of the following car, and then determined that it was a coincidence. It seems like a very difficult sequence of events to believe. In my opinion, Sandra's account is likely not true, which then prompts the question, why would she feel that it was necessary to create such a story? Was it entirely innocent? Did Sandra just want to give the detective something and so spun the story of the car following them? Or is it something more? Was it a guilty person trying to offer up possible alternatives to how Jim was murdered to try and deflect attention away from them? Jim asks a few very relevant questions about the number of turns between the CVS and when this supposed following car turned off. Now, Bob didn't have the answer, but it is clear what Jim was suggesting. If there were a significant number of turns, then clearly the chances of it being someone following them, as opposed to someone simply driving in the same direction, would be greater. And Jim also asked the question about whether the car was parked in the garage or in the driveway, presumably suggesting that if the car was parked in the driveway, a following car could turn off and then double back later and still find the house. So on both of those elements, there is nothing to indicate that if there actually was a car there, that there is any reason to believe that it was following them. In completing victimology, after Bob informs Jim that Sandra and Jim had a daughter, there is a discussion about Liz and some of the family dynamics. Now, it's interesting listening to the way in which Bob presents that. He does state that the relationship between Liz and Jim was strained, but it is repeatedly dismissed as just a rebellious period in Liz's life. Interestingly, when the drug use comes up, the full history of Liz's drug use is not disclosed. Instead, Bob notes that Liz was a drug user for a period of just 1 year. Now, if you haven't yet, I encourage you to have a look at the social media posts we have available on our website. They seem to confirm that Liz's drug use extended well beyond just that 1 year. Now, Bob notes they don't have any reports from anyone that this strained relationship between Liz and Jim was a sore spot between Jim and Sandra. And that isn't true. Sandra made that very point during her police interview when she noted that her and Jim would only ever argue about Liz. Now, one thing I'll highlight here, Jim makes the point that it was several years prior to the murder that Liz and her ex were together. And maybe he was just reading the document as Bob was talking to him, because a few minutes earlier he seemed to have no idea whether Jim and Sandra even had a daughter. Then Jim talks about the types of conflict that would need to exist in the relationship for him to have concerns that they were connected to the murder. He gives one example which I think is particularly interesting. He talks about how somebody could be overly greedy and wanting to get out of the marriage to go off and live a separate life outside of the restraints of that marriage. I think a little bit about Sandra's behaviour after the murder and the way she appears to quite readily adapt to life without Jim. There are photographs of a woman with a beaming smile, walking her dogs in knee-deep water at the beach, purchasing a raised beach house with a large number of stairs, and going on a European holiday with Liz in the months after Jim's murder. There's the photographs of her with a broad smile as she celebrates different events with a margarita in hand. So far from a situation where Sandra is entirely lost without Jim, the man Bob frames in various ways from being Sandra's essential caregiver to someone that Sandra relied upon daily for the most basic of tasks, Sandra seemed to completely thrive in her post-Jim life. They then speak a lot about Sandra's various medical conditions, and it appears that Bob's summary contained a lot of information about Sandra's ailments as this section of the discussion continues for quite some time. I think it's very relevant, and Jim raises various points about why the individual conditions and their corresponding treatment medications are important to consider. We had quite a detailed discussion on this recently on the Facebook page. I'm surprised, given the raft of claimed medical conditions, that Sandra's defence team didn't offer up more medical testimony specific to Sandra. Testimony that could have addressed each of her conditions and informed the jury of how those conditions would impact on her ability to have committed the murder. Instead, what is presented is evidence from Sandra's neurologist. And to call the doctor her neurologist is perhaps misrepresenting it a little. You see, Dr. Hershkowitz testifies that because records are destroyed when a patient doesn't visit for 10 years, he can't point to Sandra's records over that time. She perhaps visited him somewhere in the 1990s and then didn't visit him again until 2013. So what we see in Dr. Hershkowitz's testimony is a detailed discussion of the medication that Sandra was taking and the quantities, based on a report provided by another doctor. But very little, in fact virtually nothing, about what an examination of Sandra found around the time of Jim's murder. Ms. Barnett's cross-examination of Dr. Hershkowitz is straight to the point. I'll read for you the first few questions she asks of Dr. Hershkowitz. They get right to the heart of the situation with Sandra's defence. They can't offer up specifics about any of Sandra's conditions because there simply aren't any records of it. Now ask yourself why a defence team, heavily relying on Sandra's various medical ailments, would not be able to find multiple treating doctors of Sandra's to provide testimony about her condition around the time of the murder. I think the answer is quite obvious. Ms. Barnett: and so what's your diagnosis? What happened to her? Dr. Hershkowitz: I think you've been trying to decide that for about 2 weeks now, what happened to her. I, as a doctor, I'm here to clarify, educate, and explain what the possibilities are based on the information, based on the patient we know has a seizure disorder, and based on a patient who may very well have had a concussion. And I'm not here to say she had a concussion. I'm here to say this is what a concussion can do. I don't have a diagnosis. I'm not making a diagnosis. I'm here to impart information. These people have to decide what they think. Miss Barnett: well, I know that that's true, sir. So you're not here to say she had a concussion? Answer: that's correct. Ms. Barnett: you're not here to say she had a seizure? Answer: that's correct. Ms. Barnett: and you're not here to say that she had retrograde amnesia? Answer: no, I'm not here to say any of those things because I haven't examined her after. So if I haven't examined her, I'm not here to theorise. I don't deal with that. I'm just here to explain what the possibilities are. Ms. Barnett: and you're not here to say she had anterograde amnesia, is that right? Answer: I'm here to say that the way she behaved is compatible with anterograde amnesia, but your question is fair. Was it anterograde amnesia? I don't know. Ms. Barnett: exactly, and she's been having a seizure disorder for how long? Answer: when she was 19 years old, she started having seizures. Ms. Barnett: and I assume since you saw her, and when did you first start seeing her? Do you recall? Answer: probably back in the 90s. Miss Barnett: all right, and you saw her for how long? Answer: I don't know when I stopped seeing because she moved and she was under the care of other doctors, but what I can say is when I saw her in 2013, it would have had to at least 10 years since the last time, and the only reason I have that information is because we destroy records on people that haven't been seen in 10 years. The only other medical doctor, notably one that was presented by the defence, not as an expert witness, is Dr. Ogbonaya. Dr. Ogbonaya was a family GP who Sandra would work for from time to time. He is asked the specific question whether he was Sandra's treating physician, to which he replied, and to quote, "No, absolutely not." Ms. Barnett makes an excellent point during cross-examination, asking Dr. Ogbonaya whether he knows Sandra's various medical ailments. Dr. Ogbonaya notes that he was aware that Sandra had lupus and epilepsy and arthritis. Asked how he knew, and remember he is not Sandra's treating physician, he replied that Sandra had told him about her conditions. So try and balance that with the claims that are so frequently made that Sandra would never complain about her conditions. And that was it in terms of the medical experts offered up by the defence. Something so incredibly important to Sandra's defence and heavily focused on by Bob and Jim Clemente. Actually, Sandra's health is probably one of the most talked about and speculated aspects of the case from the perspective of Sandra's defence. Yet the defence is not able to offer up a single expert witness that can testify to Sandra's medical conditions at or around the time of the murder. Actually, they can't even present a treating physician who saw Sandra in the last 10 years, possibly not even in the last 20 years. It definitely paints the seriousness of Sandra's conditions in a different light when you consider it from that perspective. Now, anyone listening to this who has serious medical issues, or even moderately severe medical issues, if it were necessary today to provide evidence in the form of a treating doctor's testimony or reports covering those medical issues, do you think you could do it? If you needed to provide that for the last 5 years, could you do that? Or 10 years? I'd suggest that most people with a serious medical condition, or even a moderately serious medical condition, could do that very easily. And that is what makes Sandra's situation all the more intriguing. Jim and Bob then move on to an analysis of the blood spatter. It's a very detailed analysis, covering virtually every drop that you see on the chair that was found beside the master bed, and the consideration of multiple detailed scenarios. Now, I'm not skilled in blood spatter analysis, so I won't try and add anything further to that debate. The interesting thing I will highlight is how Bob and others, including Liz, have questioned the ability of Ms. Rossi, the state's blood spatter expert witness, to undertake the analysis that she did via viewing of crime scene photographs and not physically attending the crime scene. I think that's interesting because what we see is Jim and Bob doing exactly that, performing a detailed analysis based on photographs. I find it difficult to see the appropriateness or the legitimacy in criticising a world-renowned expert in Ms. Rossi for doing something that a layperson then goes and does himself. But in the end, that is all part of the way Bob's show is done. And we will leave it there for today and continue with the second part of Bob's interview with Jim Clemente next week. Thank you for listening to Truth is Justice. We look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.